All right, so welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah, really excited for this one.
Our listeners, they send us the most fascinating stuff. Articles, books, interviews, things that really make them think.
It's true. And our job, well, we get to sort of distill it all down, pull out those key insights, the aha moments that just stick with you.
All without, hopefully, overloading anybody?
Right. We want to be informative, but also fun.
Right.
Make it digestible.
Absolutely. And today's dive is, well, it's a bit of a philosophical one. We're going to be looking at an interview with Jonny Thomson. He's a staff writer at Big Think. And
Oh, yeah. He's got those books, too. Mini Philosophy and Mini Big Ideas. And he does the mini philosophy thing on social media, right? Yeah. Super engaging stuff.
yeah, exactly. And the interview you all sent in, well, it covers some pretty big questions. Some of life's biggest, really. What makes us happy? What is love, really?
How do we know what's right and wrong? What even is evil? All that good stuff.
And, how does all this philosophy stuff, how does it actually matter in our daily lives?
Big questions. Love it.
So I guess maybe a good place to start is with happiness, right? Because it seems like for Thomson, he didn't just randomly decide to focus on happiness. It was almost like if you look at the whole history of philosophy, it's like a heat map of ideas, and happiness is just this constant hotspot.
Yeah, I love that heat map idea. He talks about how, century after century, all these different philosophers, they keep bumping up against this question of how to live a good life.
Right, a life worth living.
Exactly. And happiness in all its different forms, it just keeps popping up as central to that question.
Yeah.
You zoom out and look at the bigger picture beyond, the specifics of what Plato was saying in ancient Greece or Confucius in China or thinkers in like the Islamic Golden Age. It's really remarkable how this theme of well-being, of leading a fulfilling life, just keeps coming up.
Yeah, it's not just some Western obsession either, right? Thomson even points out that Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, he considered happiness, or eudaimonia as he called it, to be the ultimate goal of everything we do. I mean, think about it. You work to earn money, but what's the point of money in itself? For Aristotle, it all came back to eudaimonia, this idea of flourishing.
Yeah, and then you had all these different schools of thought popping up in ancient Greece, too.
Yeah.
The Epicureans, the skeptics, the cynics, the Stoics. They were all trying to figure out how to achieve this happiness thing.
Yeah.
But like you said, it wasn't just a Greek thing. It was happening in China, the Middle East, all across Europe. It seems like a deeply human pursuit, wouldn't you say?
Totally. It's almost like it's built into us, this desire for some version of happiness. But, Thomson also points out that the word happiness itself, it can be a little tricky.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Deceptive, even.
Yeah, he uses this great example of his son, learning about emotions as a little kid. For a 4-year-old, happiness is just a giant beaming smile, right?
Pure, simple joy.
Exactly. And I think, even as adults, we can get stuck in that kind of superficial image of happiness, maybe because of social media and all that. But Thomson, he argues that real happiness, it's less about that surface level smile and more about what he calls a smiling soul. It's more aligned with Aristotle's eudaimonia, that deeper sense of well-being.
I like that smiling soul.
Oh.
And he actually brings up this really cool Taoist analogy to explain it. You got to imagine life as this really, really dense, thorny forest.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
All right, so there's this super highway running through the forest, nice and clear, easy to follow.
Makes sense. The easy path.
Right. But then you've got all these other paths branching off, some going through like swamps and thickets, real tough terrain.
Okay, getting a little trickier now.
And Thompson's point is that true happiness, it's about being on the right path for you, even if it's the one with the swamps and the thorns.
Oh.
Unhappiness, on the other hand, means you've somehow strayed onto one of the wrong paths, even if it started out looking easy.
And, we often don't even realize we're on the wrong path until things start getting really difficult.
Exactly. And that's where philosophy and theology come in, right? They act as these beacons or guides to help you find your way back to that right path, that path that leads to true happiness.
Love that analogy. So, okay, if we're all wandering around in this philosophical forest, feeling a little lost, Thomson gives us these 3 pillars of happiness, sort of like guiding principles. And the first one is that happiness, it's not just about pleasure or what the ancient Greeks call hedonia. He gives these really down-to-earth examples like, would you rather have a fancy Michelin star steak or a big bucket of KFC?
Ooh, tough choice.
Right? Or would you rather go out for a wild night of partying or stay in with a cup of herbal tea? Both options, they offer pleasure, but they're clearly not the same kind of pleasure, right?
definitely not. And Thomson, he actually connects this idea to Buddhist philosophy. In Buddhism, pleasure is seen as the satisfaction of a desire.
Okay, makes sense.
But the problem is, human desires, they're kind of limitless, right?
Yeah, we always want more.
It's like trying to empty an overflowing bathtub with a teaspoon. You'll never quite get there. So if happiness was just about satisfying every single desire, it would be totally impossible.
Yeah, we'd be chasing our tails forever. And Thomson, he brings up this really vivid example from Kierkegaard's The Seducer's Diary. This character, Johannes, he's chased every pleasure imaginable, right? But he ends up completely jaded, almost like a vampire who's tired of blood.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It really shows how empty a life focused only on those sensory pleasures can be. But then Thompson makes a really important point. He's like, hey, don't go too far in the other direction either. Don't romanticize suffering or think that being miserable somehow equals happiness.
Yeah, that's a trap.
Totally a trap. So I think this brings up this really crucial idea that we often misunderstand what actually leads to deep fulfillment. Eudaimonia, that flourishing that Aristotle talked about, it's not about those fleeting moments of pleasure. As Thompson points out, we often only recognize eudaimonia in hindsight.
Yeah, it's like looking back on a time that was maybe really challenging, raising kids or going through a tough program in school and realizing that despite all the difficulties, those were actually some of the happiest times of your life.
And that's because they were deeply meaningful.
Right, exactly. It's not about avoiding difficulty. It's about engaging in meaningful experiences.
Totally. Okay, so moving on to Thompson's second pillar of happiness, moderation, this idea of finding the middle way. And it's amazing how this concept pops up in so many different philosophical and religious traditions, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You've got the Buddhist middle path, Aristotle's golden mean.
Which, basically says that virtue lies in finding that balance between extremes. Like true courage, it's not about being reckless and it's not about being cowardly. It's about finding that sweet spot in the middle.
That golden mean. And for Aristotle, living a virtuous life, a life in accordance with those virtues, it was basically synonymous with being happy.
So interesting. And I love how Thompson connects this whole moderation thing to Taoism and the yin-yang symbol. He describes life not as, black and white, but as this confused cocktail of experiences.
Where everything's kind of gray, right?
Exactly. And so finding happiness, it's about navigating that complexity, that grayness, and finding a balance between those opposing forces, the yin and the yang, the dark, mysterious side of life and the bright, passionate side.
He also brings in this analogy from Martin Shaw's Courting the Wild Twin. The idea of castle life, representing safety and security, versus forest life, which is all about embracing our wilder instincts.
I see where he's going with this.
Right. So to be truly happy, we need to acknowledge and nurture both sides of ourselves, finding that balance between playing it safe and venturing out into the unknown.
Okay, makes total sense. All right, on to the third pillar. This idea that happiness, it actually emerges from goodness, from living a virtuous life.
A tricky one, right? Because what even is virtuous? It seems to change depending on who you ask and when you ask them.
So true. But Thompson points to the work of some philosophers, James Rachels and Paul Stearns, who've argued that despite all those surface-level differences, there are certain core virtues that seem to resonate across cultures and throughout history.
Yeah, like universal virtues.
Exactly. And he actually lays out 5 of these potential universal virtues with their opposing vices. So first, you've got altruism versus egoism. He mentions, thinkers like Augustine, Islamic teachings on zakat, Peter Singer, even Kant and Aquinas. Then there's kindness versus cruelty, pointing to the golden rule, which is found in the Gospels, Sanskrit texts, Tamil proverbs, you name it.
No, it's everywhere.
Right. And then there's justice versus injustice, wisdom versus ignorance, and humility versus arrogance. Really fascinating stuff.
So, okay, we have these 3 pillars, but how do we actually put them into practice, in our everyday lives?
Right. Well, Thompson gives some really helpful examples. For that first pillar, the difference between fleeting pleasure and deeper happiness, he talks about parenting. It's a perfect example because it can be so incredibly demanding, right? Sleepless nights, constant worries. But so many parents look back on that time and describe it as a period of profound happiness.
Totally. It's not always fun in the moment, but it's deeply meaningful.
Yeah.
And for the second pillar, moderation, use the example of dieting, something so many people struggle with, right?
All the time.
And extreme diets, they often backfire. They're just not sustainable. Whereas, something like Weight Watchers, which allows for more flexibility and doesn't demonize certain foods, it tends to be much more successful.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Not going to extremes.
Exactly. And then for the third pillar, the connection between goodness and happiness, he brings in this fascinating research on gossip by Robin Dunbar. Dunbar suggests that gossip is actually a kind of social mechanism for weeding out cruel people. They end up with fewer friends and less happiness. Whereas kind people, they tend to attract positive relationships, and as a result, they experience more happiness.
So being good actually leads to being happy.
It seems so, yeah. And I think what's really valuable about these three pillars is that, they can be used as a tool, like a diagnostic tool, for understanding our own unhappiness. If you're feeling unfulfilled, you can ask yourself, am I mistaking a rough patch for like a fundamental lack of happiness? Am I living in extremes? Am I maybe not acting as good as I could be?
It's about identifying the root cause, right?
Exactly. And once you've identified that, you can start to move towards more fulfilling path.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about love. Thompson, he admits to being a bit of a romantic, especially when he sees these older couples who are still clearly deeply in love. He talks about this almost magical quality of lasting love, love that deepens with time, with wrinkles, with gray hair. And he connects this to Plato's philosophy of love.
Yeah, Plato saw true love as something that went way beyond just physical appearance, something that transcended the ever-changing material world. He actually distinguished between two types of love. Vulgar love, which is directed at the physical, fueled by pleasure and focused on attraction and all that, and then pure love, or true love, which sees beyond the surface and recognizes the essence of a person.
So like the soul behind the body, the mind behind the eye.
Exactly. And this deeper kind of love, according to Plato, it takes time. It takes real conversations, a genuine alignment of desires and values.
That's so interesting, and it makes me think about the term platonic love. Nowadays, it usually just means a friendship without any romantic or sexual element. But Thompson points out that for Plato, love could absolutely include a sexual component. The key is that it's a means to a more profound connection with another person.
Yeah, it's about that deep union that transcends just the physical.
Right. And it's also important to remember that for Plato, true love isn't blind, as we often say. It's actually piercingly insightful. It sees the real person beneath the surface.
Which is why those long-lasting relationships can be so beautiful, right? They're based on a deep understanding and appreciation of who the other person truly is.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move on to a topic that's often a little tougher to talk about, right and wrong. Thompson admits that these can be really difficult and often controversial conversations. But he brings up this philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, and his idea of utilitarianism, which offers a pretty straightforward way of thinking about morality.
Yeah, it's basically this idea that a good action is one that creates the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Pretty simple, right?
In theory, yeah. But Bentham actually went a step further. He outlined 7 criteria of pleasure that we could use to calculate the rightness or wrongness of an action. Things like the intensity of the pleasure, how long it lasts, how likely it is to lead to more pleasure, and so on. He called it the hedonic calculus.
Wow, a whole calculus for pleasure. That's pretty intense.
It is, but Thompson points out that there are some pretty big problems with this whole approach, like who gets to decide what constitutes pleasure in the first place? And realistically, who has the time to do all these calculations every time they have to make a decision?
Right, we're constantly making moral decisions, big and small, throughout the day. It's just not practical.
Yeah, it highlights this disconnect between these really elegant philosophical theories and the messy reality of how we actually live our lives.
Okay, now for a really heavy topic. How someone becomes evil. Thompson touches on some of the more traditional ideas, like Aquinas' concept of straying from natural law, or the idea that some people are just born evil. But he really focuses on Hannah Arendt's theory of the banality of evil.
Which she developed after observing Adolf Eichmann during his trial, right?
Exactly. And Arendt, she was struck by the fact that Eichmann didn't seem like this monstrous figure, this villain you might expect. He was just this very ordinary bureaucrat who was, just doing his job, following orders.
The only, isn't it?
It really is. And it led Arendt to explore these broader societal conditions that can give rise to totalitarianism. Things like social fragmentation, isolation, and scapegoating.
blaming an outside group for all the problems.
Exactly. And in her book, The Human Condition, she argued that humans, we need action, labor, and work to truly flourish. Totalitarian regimes, they essentially deny people that action, the ability to meaningfully participate in the political sphere, to have a voice, to engage in debate.
So Eichmann, he becomes this kind of cog in the machine, never questioning the morality of his actions because the system itself discourages critical thinking.
He was just following orders, meeting his quotas, and that's what's so terrifying about the banality of evil. It suggests that evil can arise not just from, some inherent malice, but from a lack of critical thinking, a lack of individual agency.
A chilling thought for sure.
Definitely. Okay, let's move on to something a little more concrete. Money. Why does it matter? Thomson makes this really interesting point about how the most successful inventions, they become so ingrained in our lives that we can barely imagine the world without them.
Like try to picture a world without cars or smartphones. It's almost impossible.
Exactly. And he asks us to do that with money. Just imagine for a second that all money suddenly disappeared. What would we do?
I mean, I guess we'd have to go back to bartering, right?
Right, which would be incredibly inefficient.
Hmm.
And that's Thomson's point. Money, it's one of the most useful tools humanity has ever created. He traces its origins back to ancient civilizations like Egypt and the Fertile Crescent, where early forms of money were basically like these tokens that could be exchanged for goods, like grain.
And it's all based on trust,
Yeah.
right? Trust in the authority that's underwriting the currency.
Exactly. And when that trust breaks down, the currency becomes worthless. We've seen it happen in places like Zimbabwe and North Korea.
Yeah, unfortunately.
He also talks about how China, during the Song dynasty, they invented paper money. It was much more practical and less expensive than carrying around all those heavy coins.
It's amazing how something we take for granted, like money, has such a rich history, right?
Totally. And it makes you realize that money, it's not just about personal wealth. It's the foundation of our entire economic system, the thing that makes all these complex exchanges possible.
A pretty big deal when you think about it.
For sure. Okay, last but not least, why is philosophy relevant to all of us? Thomson acknowledges that philosophy often gets this reputation for being stuffy and impractical, something for academics to debate in their ivory towers.
He even tells this funny story about a lecturer who gets so caught up in his own thoughts that he forgets he's wearing glasses.
Classic.
Yeah.
But he argues that at its core, philosophy is actually deeply practical and relevant to all of us. He points out that ethics, for example, forms the basis of our legal systems. And philosophy of religion, it grapples with these fundamental questions about existence and meaning that so many people wrestle with.
And don't forget about the self-help movement, right?
Yes.
So much of it is rooted in ancient philosophical ideas.
Oh, yeah, totally. He gives a great example with cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. It has these striking similarities with Stoicism.
Like the Stoics emphasized accepting what you can't control, which is a core principle of CBT.
Right. And the Stoics talked about the importance of rationality, of being able to observe your emotions without being completely swept away by them. That's another key element of CBT.
And then there's this Stoic idea of the gap or the pause between an event and your reaction, which was articulated by Epictetus. That's another cornerstone of CBT.
It's amazing how these ancient ideas are still so relevant today, right? And Thomson, he also emphasizes the importance in philosophy of talking about your problems, of examining them intellectually, which is also central to therapy.
It's about engaging in those deep conversations, both with yourself and with others.
And he talks about how engaging with philosophy, it's not just about understanding what some dead guy thought hundreds of years ago. It's actually a way to better understand yourself. You see your own intellectual and emotional journey reflected in theirs. He uses Montaigne as an example, the 16th century essayist. You might think you're just reading about some guy from France, but you're actually engaging in a process of self-discovery.
That's the beauty of philosophy, right? It's a mirror.
And Thomson, he makes a really compelling case for why we need to bring back meaningful, in-depth conversations into our culture. We're so often caught up in superficial interactions.
Small talk, social media, all that.
Exactly. And he points out that when we avoid those deeper conversations, we create a distance not just between ourselves and other people, but also between ourselves and our own values, our own motivations.
He even suggests that philosophy could be a way to address this widespread feeling of disconnection in society, what Emile Durkheim called anomie.
I think he's onto something there. If we want to feel more connected, more fulfilled, we need to engage in those big conversations, the ones about meaning, about mortality, about right and wrong.
The conversations that really matter.
Absolutely. So there you have it, folks. a deep dive into happiness, love, morality, and the enduring power of philosophical thinking, all thanks to your curiosity and that fascinating interview with Jonny Thomson.
What really stands out to me is how these philosophical concepts, they're not just abstract ideas. They offer practical guidance for navigating life's complexities. It's a reminder that philosophy, it's not just an academic exercise. It's a tool for living a more thoughtful, more fulfilling life.
It really is. Now, for all of you listening, I want you to think about those three pillars of happiness that Thompson talked about, focusing on more than just pleasure, striving for moderation, and cultivating goodness. Which of those pillars feels most relevant to you right now? And what's one small step you could take today to strengthen that pillar in your own life?
Or maybe think about Plato's idea of true love, that piercingly insightful connection that sees beyond the superficial. In a world obsessed with fleeting attractions, how could you cultivate that deeper kind of connection in your own relationships?
Keep those fascinating sources coming our way. We're always ready to dive into whatever sparks your curiosity. Until next time, keep thinking deeply.
And keep those conversations going.